"Strip down and get in my bed tonight." Mountain Man ordered the obese, mail-order bride, but his real intention was, "Strip down and get in my bed tonight." The words cracked across Silverpine's autumn air like a whip, crary, jeering, and viciously misunderstood as they ricocheted through the crowd. Rosalie Harper stood on the timber dais with turnips and laughter hitting like hail. She had traveled 3,000 miles from Philadelphia to this square, a letter-promised future folded in the pocket of her faded traveling dress. Now, every mile felt like a joke at her expense. William Blackwell, cloth merchant and self-styled pillar of propriety, paraded up and down before her, his face pink with wine and pride. "Look at this deceit," he proclaimed. "She sends a portrait from years ago and expects a gentleman to marry a barrel." The crowd obliged him. Somebody snorted like a barnyard pig. Another whistled for a show. Rosalie, cheeks burning, wanted to explain that the portrait was not a lie, only a moment, one she had outgrown along with the corset that once made breathing a negotiation. But explanation required mercy, and Silverpine offered none. "Pay back my costs," William said, flourishing a crumpled ledger, "or you'll labor in my storeroom until your debt is ash." The ledger might as well have been a noose. Rosalie had spent the last of her money on the stagecoach from Helena, a thin blanket, and a wedge of cheese she could not finish after the driver's jokes started landing on her shoulders. Two drunk ranch hands lurched near the platform. One caught her sleeve and tugged, testing the fabric as if pricing it. "If he won't have you, I might," he slurred. Laughter swelled again. Rosalie pulled free and folded her arms across herself, a ship bracing for storm. Then the storm changed. A single horse clopped into the square and stopped. Its rider didn't shout, didn't posture. He dismounted with the quiet of a fallen pine cone. Nathaniel Blackwood, Nate to the 2 or 3 men in town who had reason to speak his name, stood nearly a head taller than everyone else, broad as a barn door, beard dark as wet bark. He smelled of spruce and wood smoke and something colder, ridge wind off first snow. He stepped through the press of bodies without touching a soul. The crowd parted anyway. At the foot of the platform, he shrugged out of his heavy coat and draped it over Rosalie's shoulders. Heat pooled beneath it. The wool held the day's sun and the clean scent of the mountain. His voice, when it came, was even and low. "She's done nothing wrong." William tried to laugh and found no echo. "This is my fiancée, and I'll decide what to do with her." "No," Nate said. "You broke the contract the moment you dragged her here." He lifted his gaze to the ring of faces. "Show's over." A ranch hand swung first. Nate's forearm rose like a gate. The blow died against it. 2 quick movements. One man folded, another sprawled. The square went breathless. Nate looked up at Rosalie. "Step down," he said. "You're leaving with me." Her knees shook. Fear, shame, a spark of something wilder. Behind Nate, the road curled toward dark pines and thin, high air. Behind her, the crowd waited for the next cruelty. She gathered the coat tighter, met his steady eyes, and put one boot on the stair. Before she moved another inch, Nate lifted his chin at William and said, clearly enough for every window to hear, "She will sleep in my bed tonight." The square gasped. Nate didn't blink. "Because it's the only warm bed in miles, and I'll take the chair." "Where are you listening from tonight? City apartment, farmhouse kitchen, or the late bus home?" The road out of Silverpine rose in ribbing switchbacks. each bend carving away a little more of the shouting behind them until only the wind had a voice. Rosalie rode ahead of Nate in the saddle while he walked, one hand on the bridle, pacing the big roan as if he had all the night and nothing to prove. His coat swallowed her, its seams rough with honest work. Beneath the wool, humiliation still burned hot and sour, but it no longer had an audience. It had only her breath, quick and visible in the early cold. Silverpine had looked polished from the coach at noon, clapboard storefronts with fresh paint, a church steeple sharp as a finger pointing heavenward, the hotel's porch braided with drying hops. It was the sort of town that sold civility by the yard, then shorted you at the counter. In the alleys, the cold already smelled of winter, pitch, iron, and the first scabs of frost in wagon ruts. Folks here adored a spectacle almost as much as they adored a payer of taxes, and William Blackwell paid both. Rosalie pressed her cheek to the roan's mane to steady herself. She had sent honest letters, line after careful line by lamplight, in a boarding house that creaked with the weight of other women's hopes. She wrote about reading and accounts, about baking bread that cracked with a music of crust, about wanting to make a home with a man who wanted a home made with him. She included a portrait because men asked for proof the way shopkeepers ask for coin. The portrait showed a round face and a shy smile. The rest had been a dressmaker's art and the photographer's flattery. Between photograph and departure, life had set its hand on her more firmly. Grief over her father's illness had added softness. Overtime at the mill had thickened her arms. Cheap dinners and cheaper sleep had done the rest. She'd learned to be matter-of-fact about her body, the way a sailor is about weather. You work in it, or you don't work at all. "Keep the coat," Nate said, breaking the hush. "Mountain nights drop fast." "Thank you," she managed. Her voice cracked and embarrassed itself. "I'm sorry for the trouble." Nate didn't slow. "You aren't trouble." That should have been the end of it, but words crowded at the back of Rosalie's teeth. "Back there, when you said the thing about your bed—" "I said it so they'd stop picturing something else," he answered, plain as a fence post. "They were hungry for the wrong story. I gave them a dull one." It struck her that he understood crowds the way he understood weather fronts. You don't argue with a squall, you shape its direction and keep moving. "Who are you?" she asked, not to make conversation, but to plant a stake in the ground of the world as it would be next. "Nathaniel Blackwood, Nate's fine." "Rosalie Harper," she offered, then softer. "Rosie to my sister. When we wrote?" He nodded, eyes on the narrowing track. He had the look of somebody who'd learned how not to startle deer and how to place his feet where rocks wouldn't roll. She wondered how long it had taken to move that quietly inside his own grief. They made the ridge at dusk. Pines steepled black against a purpled sky, and smoke from somewhere ahead stitched a dark thread into the air. Nate's cabin appeared by degrees. First the pen for the roan, then a split-rail fence summer-silvered by storms, then the house proper, a broad-shouldered structure set back among trees as if the forest had agreed to let this one square of light belong to people. Through the window, fire moved like a living thing. Inside, warmth introduced itself as more than temperature. It had the weight of safety. The room was square and clean, tools hung in order on pegs, books along one wall, a long table rubbed to a low sheen by elbows and meals. No clutter that shouted loneliness, no trophies that shouted conquest. Just a place shaped by use. Sit, Nate said, hanging his hat and moving to the hearth. He ladled stew that smelled of thyme and venison into a tin bowl and set bread beside it, still warm from the Dutch oven. He did not watch her eat, which let her eat. She surprised herself by finishing and then by admitting she had finished. Only after her hand stopped shaking did the day begin to explain itself aloud. Words came haltingly at first, then with a rush. The exchange of letters, the train west with women dabbing at the windows for better light, the stage from Helena rattling the last plans loose, the moment William's mouth turned into a blade. She did not say every insult the crowd had volunteered, some word stained twice if repeated. She did say that she had nowhere to go if not back to the mill, and that the mill meant the boarding house, and the boarding house meant being the oldest unmarried woman at a table where hope had to shout over despair. Nate listened the way the forest listens. No interruption, no hurry. "You're not going back tonight," he said when she faltered. "You're not going back because you were never his to return. You'll sleep here. In my bed," he confirmed, "because it's soft and because chairs make poor nurses. I'll take the rocker. I've done worse." He stoked the fire, then set about putting his statement into action. He hauled a copper tub near the hearth, bucketed water from a kettle, set a screen so that privacy became something more than a promise. From a cedar chest he drew a folded bundle, lawn nightdress, woolen stockings, a shawl edged in patient stitches. He laid them outside the screen as if persuaded that quiet could be gentler than apology. Rosalie's fingers lingered on the shawl's edging. The pattern had the kind of neatness that grows from long evenings and the companionship of a ticking clock. She pictured the woman whose work it was, and the thought landed in her chest like a careful weight. "Your wife?" she asked, when she had bathed and changed, and the room had settled into its nighttime shape. "Elizabeth," he said, the name both blade and balm. "4 winters gone." He didn't expand, and she didn't press. Grief has its own timetable and its own stubborn key. She folded the old clothes, hands moving to keep from spilling over. "I'm sorry," she said, "because sometimes the smallest phrase does the most work." Nate spread a quilt on the rocker, tested the angle with a small grimace that admitted the human spine's preferences, and found a compromise. "Door stays cracked," he said. "You call if anything feels wrong, cold, pain, memory." "Memory?" The word startled her. "It can bite," he said, "harder than wind." The lamp burned low. Beyond the walls the forest shifted and breathed, a body larger than their own. Rosalie slid beneath sheets that smelled faintly of soap and cedar and something like summer. She had not been inside such warmth since leaving Philadelphia. It should have felt like trespassing. Instead, it felt like permission. She woke once in the night to the sound of him by the stove, adding a log so the room's pulse would not fail. He moved barefoot to spare the floor's creak, and her sleep then settled again, the rocker's slow arc telling time for both of them. He was a big man learning how to take up less space so she could take up more. In the raw light of early morning, frost etched the window's corners. Nate set coffee to percolate and turned, as if continuing a conversation they'd only paused. "When the pass clears, we'll ride down. You can send a wire to anyone you trust. As for Blackwell, leave him to me and to the law that actually lives this far up." "Will the town let me be?" she asked. The truth she wanted was simple. "Do I have a place that isn't a stage?" "They don't decide that," he said. "You do." Outside, a jay scolded the day into motion. Inside, Rosalie wrapped the shawl once more around her shoulders and let its warmth argue with the last cold corner inside her. The world had tried to cast her as a spectacle. Nate had rewritten the scene with 3 plain lines. You're safe. You're not alone. You get a bed. By the 3rd day, the air itself seemed to change allegiance. The scent of the lowland, dust, manure, cheap whiskey, fell away behind them, replaced by pine, wet bark, and the clean bite of altitude. The farther they climbed, the more the world pared itself down to essentials: wind, stone, and breath. Rosalie rode double with Nate at first, his broad chest a wall of warmth against her back. Later, when the trail narrowed into switchbacks cut by melting snow, he guided the horse by its reins, leading on foot while she stayed mounted. She had offered to walk twice, and both times he had said the same quiet thing: "You've walked enough." They spoke little, but silence didn't bruise between them. It simply lay there, companionable as firewood. The clop of hooves and the sigh of the trees filled the spaces words might have spoiled. Occasionally, Nate pointed out a hawk's nest, high in the firs, or a stream where ice curled like glass. Rosalie realized she was watching him more than the view: how sure his hands were, how his steps sought the firm ground without glancing down. He moved as if the mountain recognized him. At midday, they stopped beside a creek. Nate tethered the horse, knelt to cup water, then motioned for her to do the same. "Cold," he warned. She dipped her fingers anyway and gasped. "Cold," she echoed, laughing despite herself. It startled them both, a sound bright enough to startle birds from a nearby branch. Nate's mouth quirked upward in something nearly a smile. He unpacked bread and smoked venison wrapped in cloth. "Eat slow," he said, handing her a piece. "The climb's steep ahead." Rosalie chewed, watching sunlight spill through the canopy. "You live up here all year?" "Most of it," Nate said. "The snow buries the pass some winters. I keep supplies: trapping, hunting, repairs for the posts. It's quieter than people think." "Quiet can be lonely," she ventured. He shrugged. "Quiet can also heal." They moved again by late afternoon. The trail dipped into a hollow where mist pooled and frost glimmered on every pine needle. Rosalie shivered. Nate noticed and stopped, pulling his coat tighter around her shoulders. "Better?" "Yes," she whispered. The brush of his knuckles at her collarbone felt like a secret exchanged. As night fell, they reached a clearing beside a frozen pond. Nate built a fire with practiced economy: log, kindling, spark. Flames sprang up obediently. He pitched a small canvas shelter, then spread 2 bedrolls, one near the fire, one slightly apart. "You'll take the warm side," he said. "I can't have you freezing for my sake," she protested. "I've weathered worse nights than this. I'd still feel wrong." He studied her face, then nodded once. "Then we'll both take the warm side. There's space enough." When the fire settled to embers, they lay facing opposite directions, backs only inches apart. Between them, the night spoke in small sounds: crackle, wind, the horse's occasional snort. Rosalie closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. She could sense Nate awake too, his breathing deep but uneven. Finally, his voice broke the darkness. "When I first came west, I thought silence meant peace. Turns out it just makes you hear yourself louder." She turned her head. "And what do you hear?" "Things I'd rather forget. A cry I couldn't answer in time." He didn't need to say her name, Elizabeth, for her to understand. Rosalie hesitated, then reached behind her until her fingers brushed his sleeve. "You did what you could. The rest isn't on you." For a long moment, he didn't move. Then his hand covered hers, rough, warm, steady. "You talk like someone who's carried her own ghosts." "I have," she said quietly. "They whisper different things, but they don't leave either." They lay like that until sleep finally found them, the fire dimming to a red eye that watched without judgment. Morning dawned thin and gold. Nate was already up, tending the fire and feeding the horse. He looked over his shoulder when she stirred. "There's coffee," he said simply, as if the intimacy of the night before hadn't existed. Rosalie accepted the tin cup he offered. The brew was bitter, but its warmth spread quickly. She studied him in the light, how the sun picked out the silver in his beard, how his eyes softened when he caught her gaze. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not leaving me there, for bringing me here, for all of it?" He nodded, looking away toward the ridge. No man worth his breath leaves cruelty unanswered. They broke camp and continued upward. Snow thickened underfoot. The trees grew sparse. When they reached the crest, the valley below unfurled, a wide quilt of gold and evergreen, stitched with a silver river. Rosalie drew in a breath that ached sweetly. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "It's honest," Nate replied. "Up here nothing pretends." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw that he wasn't carved from rough stone as she'd first thought. He was weathered wood, strong, scarred, but still warm under sunlight. When they descended into his valley, the wind eased. Smoke rose from a chimney ahead, his cabin, waiting with the patience of places built to outlast sorrow. Rosalie felt something loosen in her chest, something that might one day resemble belonging. Nate led the horse to the gate and turned to her. "From here, you can decide what comes next," he said. "I don't have much choice," she admitted. "You've got more than you think." His tone was gentle but sure. "The mountain doesn't judge shape or past, only courage." As he lifted her down from the saddle, his hands lingered a heartbeat too long at her waist. She felt it. Safety first, then a pulse of something tenderer, more dangerous. Their eyes met. Neither spoke. The moment passed, but not completely. Inside the cabin, fire waited to be rekindled. Outside, twilight folded around them like a promise. By the time the first real snow came, the mountain had claimed Rosalie. It showed in her hands, once soft, now bearing faint nicks from chopping wood. It showed in the way she moved around Nate's cabin. Quiet, sure-footed, as if the floor had memorized her steps. At dawn, the valley was a hush of blue and silver. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin line, straight as a prayer. Inside, the fire glowed low, and Rosalie stirred the pot hanging over it, humming an old hymn from Philadelphia that had once comforted her mother. Nate was outside, splitting logs. Each strike echoed like a heartbeat through the cold air. She had learned that sound. It meant safety. When he came in, breath fogging and shoulders dusted with snow, she met him with a smile. "Breakfast ready," she said. "Smells like heaven." "Smells like venison stew again," she teased. He shrugged. "Heaven probably smells like stew on a cold morning." They ate together at the rough-hewn table by the window. It wasn't romance, not yet. Not the kind people wrote about in novels. It was something smaller and deeper. The comfort of passing the bread before the other asked. The silence that didn't need mending. The way his eyes softened every time she tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The cabin itself became a world apart. There was the main room, fireplace, table, 2 chairs, shelves stacked with jars of preserves and carefully folded maps. A narrow hallway led to 2 doors, Nate's small room and the one that had once belonged to his late wife, Elizabeth. Rosalie slept there now. At first, she had felt like a trespasser, touching nothing, barely daring to breathe. But Nate had told her gently, "It's a room, not a shrine." She wouldn't want dust for company. So Rosalie cleaned. She aired the linens, arranged wild flowers in a chipped jar, polished the mirror. She didn't replace Elizabeth's presence. She simply gave it light. In the evenings, Nate would mend traps or sharpen tools while Rosalie sewed. Sometimes, when her fingers cramped, he would look up and say, "Come here." Then he'd take her hands in his, rubbing warmth into her fingers, his thumb tracing the small scars she'd earned. "Getting tougher," he'd murmur. "Maybe one day I'll be half as strong as you." "You already are." Outside, the mountain howled. Inside, they built small rituals of tenderness against it. One afternoon, the snow fell so thick it erased the world beyond the porch. They stayed in, drinking coffee that had long since gone bitter but warm. Rosalie sat by the fire, trying to darn a sock with a thread that refused to behave. Nate, from his chair, watched her struggle for a moment, then said, "May I?" She handed it over, half embarrassed. "I'm better with cooking than stitching." "Stitches and snares," he said, threading the needle easily. "Both just patience." She smiled faintly. "You talk like someone who spent a lifetime fixing things, mostly breaking them first." For the first time, he told her about the war, the way the noise never truly left, the things a man carries long after the fighting ends. He didn't speak long, but when he fell silent, Rosalie reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "You fix more than you break now," she whispered. His thumb turned, brushed her knuckles once. "Because someone reminded me how." The fire cracked. Their eyes met. Neither moved closer, yet something invisible did. A thread drawn taut between them, humming with unspoken promise. By late winter, Rosalie had learned the rhythm of the mountain. In the mornings, she shoveled snow from the porch, her cheeks flushed pink from cold. At midday, she baked bread, filling the cabin with warmth. At night, she and Nate sat by the fire, the silence between them filled with comfort, not distance. Sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, he'd watch her, the way she tilted her head while reading, or the way she laughed softly to herself when stirring the pot. Once, she caught him and asked, half teasing, "What are you thinking when you look at me like that?" He hesitated. "That I thought I'd buried peace in the ground with Elizabeth. Turns out it just waited until now." Her eyes welled. She turned away, pretending to check the stew. But her voice trembled when she said, "You shouldn't say things that make me cry, Nate Blackwood." "Then stop being the kind of woman who makes a man mean every word." A blizzard came without warning. The wind screamed around the cabin, shaking the shutters like angry fists. Nate secured the door while Rosalie fed the fire. "Will it hold?" she asked. "It's held worse." Still, fear flickered in her eyes. She had grown up with city storms, not the kind that could swallow a mountain whole. When the gusts grew violent, Nate crossed the room and drew her against his chest. "Easy," he said. "The mountain's loud, but it's not cruel. Just wants to remind us Who's stronger? Rosalie pressed her face into his coat, feeling his heartbeat steady and slow. I'm not afraid, she lied. He smiled into her hair. Then you're braver than I was my first winter here. They stood like that, wrapped in warmth and thunder. When the storm finally began to fade, she stayed close, unwilling to break the stillness. Her hands rested lightly on his chest, rising and falling with his breath. He looked down at her, a flicker of something fierce and tender in his eyes. Rosalie, he said softly, you don't have to be alone anymore. Her reply was a whisper against his coat. I'm not. The thaw came slowly, and with it, color. Ice melted into laughter. Pine needles glistened, and something inside Rosalie unfurled too, a courage she'd never thought she possessed. One morning, she was kneading dough when Nate came in from outside, his hair damp with melting snow. I fixed the fence, he said, brushing snow off his shoulders. She looked up, flour on her cheeks, and smiled. Then breakfast's your reward. He grinned. That's all the reward a man could need. She laughed, rolling her eyes, but her heart tripped over the warmth in his tone. When he came up behind her to wash his hands at the basin, his chest brushed her shoulder. She froze, aware of his nearness, the smell of pine, smoke, and something deeply him. He leaned close, his breath warm against her ear. You're trembling? She turned, flustered. It's the cold. It's warm in here, he murmured. It's the bread, she said weakly. Their eyes met. The moment stretched. He reached up, brushed a bit of flour from her cheek, his thumb lingering longer than it should. Neither of them spoke, but in that silence, something shifted permanently, an invisible door opening toward something tender, inevitable. That night, Rosalie wrote a letter she would never send to the girl she'd been, waiting on a Philadelphia porch for letters that promised a fairy tale marriage. You thought love would be a rescue, she wrote. You were wrong. Love is a home-built plank by plank beside someone who teaches you how to stay. When she folded the paper, Nate's voice came from the doorway. You're awake late. Couldn't sleep. Storms passed. Come see. She followed him to the porch. The valley lay under a silver moon, every pine crusted in snow that glittered like dusted glass. The sky was so clear it seemed infinite. Nate slipped an arm around her shoulders. The mountain's at peace again, he said. So am I, she whispered. And for the first time, it was true. Spring arrived like a cautious guest, slow to knock, slower still to stay. The snow began to retreat in thin ribbons from the slopes, and the river below Nate's cabin found its voice again, babbling over thawed stones. Rosalie had never seen the world renew itself like this. Green, fighting its way through white, life insisting it deserved another chance. She felt the same way. In the months since that first storm, she and Nate had fallen into a rhythm that felt like destiny disguised as routine. She baked. He hunted. They mended fences, traded stories, and laughed more than either had expected. Sometimes, when the evenings stretched long and quiet, Nate would read aloud from the books he'd brought up the mountain, travel journals, old poetry, even the Bible, when the night felt too big. His deep voice wrapped around the words like a promise, yet even as warmth bloomed inside the cabin, shadows gathered outside it. One evening, Nate returned from the trading post with a clouded look. He said little over supper, only pushed food around his plate. Rosalie noticed, but didn't press. Until later, When the fire burned low and silence turned heavy. "What happened?" she asked softly. Nate hesitated, then said, "There were men talking in town. About you." Her stomach dropped. "About me?" "About what happened in Silver Pine. They said William Blackwell's been boasting, claims you ran off with his money, that he's sending the sheriff to get it back." Rosalie's spoon clattered against her bowl. "That's a lie. I didn't take anything. He tried to." Her voice broke, the memory too raw to finish. "I know," Nate said quickly, his hand covering hers. "I know what happened, Rosie, but the town doesn't care about truth. They care about stories, and the one he's telling makes you the villain." Tears welled in her eyes. "He humiliated me once. I can't—" Nate's jaw tightened. "You won't face him alone this time." Over the next few days, a tension settled in the cabin like fog. Rosalie tried to busy herself, kneading dough, scrubbing floors, hanging laundry, but her thoughts kept circling back to Silver Pine, to the jeers, the laughter, the way she'd felt small enough to disappear. At night, she'd wake to find Nate sitting by the window, rifle across his lap, eyes on the dark woods beyond. "Do you really think he'll come?" she asked one night. Nate didn't turn. "Men like him don't forget humiliation. They rewrite it into revenge." Rosalie shivered, pulling the quilt tighter around her. "Then what do we do?" "We wait, and if he comes, we finish it." But Nate had his own secret, one he hadn't told her, though it weighed on him every day. Before the war, before Elizabeth, before the mountain, he'd worn a badge. Deputy Marshal. He had seen what men like Blackwell could do when the law bent their way. He had also seen what happened when a man tried to fight back alone. He had killed once, defending a woman not unlike Rosalie. The memory never left him. He wasn't sure he could do it again. And yet, if it came to that, he knew he would. For her. A week later, the storm broke, not from the sky, but from the valley. They heard the horses before they saw them. Nate was out by the barn when the first distant echo of hooves reached him. He froze, head tilted. Then he moved fast. "Rosalie!" he called, bursting through the door. "Get inside. Lock the shutters." She dropped the pan she was washing, heart leaping to her throat. "Is it Blackwell?" The name felt like poison in her mouth. "How many?" "4, maybe 5. She ran to close the windows while Nate loaded the rifle. "You could let them take me," she said suddenly, voice shaking. "It would end it. You'd be safe." He stopped, turning sharply. "Don't you ever say that again." "But, Rosie," his voice was low, fierce, "you're not something to trade. You're not his debt to collect. You're mine to protect if you'll let me." Her eyes filled. "I never wanted anyone to fight for me." "Too late," he said, a grim smile touching his mouth. "I started the moment I saw you." The men came up the trail near sunset. 5 riders, their coats dark against the pale light, rifles across their saddles. Blackwell rode in front, face red with drink and pride. Nate stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. "That's far enough," he said. Blackwell laughed, the sound sharp and mean. "Look at this. The mountain beast guarding his prize. You got my woman Blackwood and my money." "She's not your anything," Nate said evenly, "and you'll turn around now before the mountain keeps you." Blackwell spat into the snow. "I'll see her burn before she makes a fool of me again." Rosalie, watching through the crack in the door, flinched. The words pierced straight through time to that day in the square. But this time, she wasn't alone. Nate lifted the rifle. Last warning. The gunfire came almost instantly. Shots cracked through the valley, echoing off stone. The horse nearest Blackwell reared, shrieking. Nate fired again, clean and controlled, driving them back behind the ridge. One man went down, clutching his arm. Another dropped his rifle and bolted. Blackwell shouted orders, but the others hesitated. The mountain was turning against them. The terrain, the echo, the man they'd underestimated. Then a bullet struck the porch beam near Nate's head, splintering wood. He ducked and fired back. Rosalie cried out from inside, "Nate!" "I'm fine," he shouted. "Stay low." When the smoke cleared, only Blackwell remained upright. His men were gone, either wounded or running. He stumbled forward, clutching his shoulder, sneering through blood. "You think you've won, mountain man? You can't hide her forever. I'll find her. I'll drag her back down in front of everyone, make her crawl again." Nate's rifle barrel leveled with his chest, but before he could fire, Rosalie stepped out onto the porch. "Stop," she said. Nate's head whipped toward her. "Rosie, get back inside." "No." She stood beside him, shoulders squared, eyes steady despite the tears brimming in them. "He's not worth your soul." Blackwell laughed weakly. "Listen to her." "Be quiet." Rosalie's voice sliced through the air. She stepped closer, staring him down. "You took my dignity once. You won't take it again. Leave, William. Leave, or the next bullet will be mine." Something in her tone, calm, final, broke whatever pride he had left. He turned, stumbling toward his horse. "This isn't over," he hissed. "It is for you," Nate said coldly. Blackwell mounted and rode off into the trees, his figure shrinking into the dusk. When it was over, Rosalie sank to her knees, trembling. Nate caught her before she fell, pulling her into his arms. "It's done," he whispered. "It's over." She buried her face in his chest, sobbing. "I thought I'd lost you." "You won't," he said. "Not while I breathe." They stayed like that for a long time, the firelight flickering over them through the doorway, the man who had spent years hiding from life, and the woman who had just reclaimed hers. Outside, the last echo of hooves faded into silence. Inside, the heartbeat of the cabin, steady, human, and whole, filled the space they'd fought to keep. For a few weeks, the mountain seemed merciful again. The snow melted from the ridges, and life crept cautiously back into the valley. But peace, Rosalie learned, was never a promise. It was a breath held between storms. Nate's shoulder wound from the gunfight healed slowly, though he pretended otherwise. He chopped wood with one arm, refusing to rest, and every time she scolded him, he'd answer the same way. "Can't let the mountain think I've gone soft." But at night, when he thought she was asleep, she'd hear him groan quietly as he cleaned the wound. And once, when she crept closer, she saw blood dark against his bandage again. "You're tearing it open," she whispered, kneeling beside him. "I'll live." "You'll die if you don't let it heal." His eyes lifted to hers, tired, dark, tender. "I'd die faster if I stopped fighting." Something in those words made her heart twist. He wasn't just fighting the wound. He was fighting the ghosts of war, of Elizabeth, of every man he couldn't save. She reached up and touched his cheek. "Then let me fight with you." For the first time, Nate didn't argue. He just leaned forward until his forehead rested against hers. "You already are." That night, the dream came again. Rosalie woke to the sound of Nate shouting, hoarse, broken, like a man drowning in his own memories. "Elizabeth, no, no, don't!" She rushed to him. He sat upright, drenched in sweat, eyes wild until they focused on her. "It's me," she said softly. "It's Rosie." His breathing slowed. He swallowed hard. "I saw her again, in the snow, calling me." Rosalie sat beside him, took his hand. "She's not calling you away, Nate. She's letting you go." He looked at her then, really looked, and something inside him seemed to unclench. He brushed a thumb along her jaw, voice low. "You're the first person who said that." "Because it's true." He bent his head and kissed her, slow, searching, as if to be sure she was real. The fire crackled softly beside them. When they finally parted, his voice was a whisper against her skin. "You bring me back, Rosie, every time." 3 nights later, the storm broke again, this time from the human world below. A sharp knock shattered the midnight quiet. Nate moved instantly, rifle in hand. Rosalie's heart lurched. Who could... Before she could finish, the door flew open, and a stranger stumbled inside, half frozen, gasping for air. His clothes bore the star of a federal deputy. "Are you Nate Blackwood?" the man panted. "Marshall sent me from Cheyenne. Blackwell's dead." Nate froze. Dead. Found shot in the back 2 valleys over. His men said he was coming for you. Word is, someone beat him to it. Rosalie covered her mouth. "You think they'll blame you?" The deputy nodded grimly. "Already are. Sheriff's riding up tomorrow to take you in." When the deputy left before dawn, the silence he left behind was heavy. Rosalie turned to Nate, pale. "You can't go down there. They'll hang you before they listen." Nate stared into the fire. "If I don't, they'll come here. They'll come for you." "Then we'll run," she pleaded. "There's a pass north. You said it leads to Idaho." "Rosie?" He looked up and his voice was steady, almost calm. "A man runs once, he never stops. I'm not hiding any more." Her throat tightened. "You're not that man. You're not the killer they'll say you are." He smiled faintly. "Then maybe it's time they see who I really am." At sunrise, he saddled his horse. The sky was pale gold, the air sharp and still. Rosalie stood in the doorway, trembling. He reached into his coat, pulled out the silver locket she had once worn around her neck, the one she thought lost that terrible day in Silverpine. "Found it in the saddlebag," he said. "Guess it was waiting to be returned." Her tears spilled over. "Nate, please." He stepped close, pressing the locket into her hand. "If I don't come back, you'll know where my heart stayed." She caught his arm. "If you go, I'm coming too." He smiled, a real smile, full of warmth and sorrow. "No, sweetheart, the mountain needs at least one of us to keep it alive." Then, before she could stop him, he kissed her once more, deep, final, and rode down the trail into the morning mist. Rosalie watched until the forest swallowed him whole. The mountain, once her refuge, now felt like a cathedral holding its breath. And somewhere far below, justice, or something that only resembled it, was waiting. The mountain fell silent after Nate rode away. Each morning, Rosalie rose before dawn, lighting the fire as if he might walk in any moment, cold and hungry and smiling at her scolding. She cooked for 2, mended his shirts, and waited. Days became weeks. The snow melted into rushing streams, then the grass began to green again. But no rider appeared on the trail. At night, she sat on the porch, Nate's coat around her shoulders, the locket warm against her chest. Sometimes she whispered his name into the wind, half believing the mountain might carry it to him. "You said you'd come back," she murmured, "and I believe you. I have to." Inside her, the cabin still breathed him, his tools on the wall, his book open where he'd left it, the mug he always used beside the hearth, everything in its place, everything waiting. Then one evening, weeks after she'd stopped marking the days, she heard it, a faint rhythm on the wind, the steady beat of hooves. Her heart stumbled. She rushed to the porch, squinting through the dusk. At first, she saw nothing. Then a shadow broke free from the tree line, tall, broad-shouldered, riding slow. Her hands flew to her mouth. Nate. He looked thinner, older, his coat torn, but his eyes, those steady, storm-colored eyes, were the same. He dismounted with care, limping slightly, and when she ran to him, he caught her mid-stride, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. "I told you," he said hoarsely, "I'd come home." She was crying and laughing all at once. "They didn't—" "They listened," he said, still holding her close. "Deputy cleared it. Turns out one of Blackwell's men confessed, said greed took care of greed. I walked free 3 days ago." Rosalie pressed her forehead to his. "You walked all this way?" "Didn't trust my luck on a borrowed horse." He smiled faintly. "Besides, I had a home to come back to." Later, as the fire burned low, he told her everything, the trial, the confession, the long walk north. She listened, her hand never leaving his. When he finished, she said softly, "Then it's over." He shook his head. "No, it's beginning." He looked around the cabin, at the warm light, the steady fire, and then at her, her hair unbound, her eyes still shining through tears. "I've been running from ghosts for too long, Rosie, but you made me remember what living feels like." She smiled, the kind of smile that holds both grief and grace. "And you made me believe that love doesn't have to hurt to be real." He leaned forward and kissed her, slow and certain. "Then we stay," he whispered. "No more leaving, no more fear." Outside, the mountain exhaled a long sigh of wind through the pines, as if it too had been waiting for this peace. That night, long after the fire dimmed, Rosalie lay beside Nate, listening to his heartbeat steady under her ear. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of tomorrow. The world outside would always be wild, but inside this cabin, love had found its quiet refuge, and somewhere between the whisper of pine and the crackle of embers, she heard Nate murmur, half in sleep, half in promise, "You're safe here, Rosie. It's your home now, if you'll have it." Her answer came in a whisper against his chest, "I already do." Every time I tell a story like Nate and Rosalie's, I'm reminded that love isn't born from beauty. It's born from courage. It's the choice to stay when the world tells you to leave, to build warmth in the coldest places, to believe that even the scarred and the shamed still deserve gentleness. Wherever you're listening from, maybe a small town, maybe a busy city, maybe a quiet room where no one knows your story, I hope this one touched your heart. Tell me where you're hearing this from tonight, and stay close. Our next story begins with another broken heart, finding home again.